By day, he was the architect of the British Army and the puppet master of the Crown. But in the shadows, Reginald Brett concealed a life capable of shattering the empire. He was driven by a pathological obsession with youth, willing to psychologically groom his own son and corrupt the War Office to sustain his forbidden affairs. The man who fixed the monarchy was broken by his own dark desires. But there was another Reginald Brett, a man who lived entirely apart from the ledgers of statecraft and military reform. While he was advising monarchs on how to maintain their moral dignity in the face of a changing world, he was living a private life that, had it been exposed, would have shattered his carefully constructed existence. It was a life governed by a terrifying fear of aging, a worship of youth that bordered on the religious, and a series of intense boundary-blurring relationships that defied the rigid morality of his era. To understand the tragedy and the controversy of his later years, the emotional suffocation of his son, and the corruption of his public office for the sake of a secretary, we must first understand the mask he wore. We must understand the immaculate, impenetrable facade of the perfect Edwardian gentleman. Born in 1852, Aysher was a child of the establishment. His father was a prominent judge, a master of the rolls, and young Reginald was groomed for a life of conventional success. He breathed the air of the upper class, a rarefied atmosphere where duty was the primary currency and emotion was something to be repressed or, at the very least, kept strictly indoors. On the surface, he played the game better than anyone. He knew the unwritten rules of his tribe. You must marry well, you must breed heirs, and you must maintain the appearance of effortless superiority. In 1879, he made the move that would secure his fortress. He married Eleanor van de Weyer. It was by every metric of their society a brilliant match. Eleanor was the daughter of the Belgian ambassador, and more importantly, the granddaughter of Joshua Bates, the American financier who was a senior partner at Barings Bank. She brought with her not just social grace, but immense wealth. This union allowed Aysher to live in a style that his own inheritance might not have supported. It gave him the grand country estate Orchardly and a townhouse in Mayfair. It gave him the freedom to not work for a living, but to work for influence. Eleanor was dutiful, long-suffering, and by all accounts devoted to him. Together they created a tableau of domestic perfection. They had 4 children: Oliver, Maurice, Dorothy, and Sylvia. To the outside world, the Brett family was a model of Victorian virtue. Aysher was the patriarch, the wise father, the steady hand. He wrote letters to the newspapers about public morality. He advised the royal family on how to sanitize their image, urging the philandering Edward VII to keep his mistresses out of the public eye to preserve the sanctity of the crown. He was the architect of respectability, the man who ensured the shop window of the British aristocracy remained pristine. But a shop window is designed to keep you from looking too closely at what is stored in the back room. Aysher's marriage, while functional and productive, was a screen. It was a lavender marriage in function, if not in name, a partnership that provided cover for a man whose true emotional compass pointed in a direction that society deemed criminal. Aysher was not merely a man with secrets. He was a man who belonged to a specific hidden subculture of the Victorian elite, a group that quietly rejected the stifling heteronormativity of their time in favor of what they called Greek love. This was not the open, politicized identity of the modern era. It was something more shadowed, wrapped in the language of classical scholarship and high art. Aysher and his like-minded peers looked back to ancient Athens, to the relationship between the Erastes, the older lover and mentor, and the Eromenos, the younger beloved. They convinced themselves that their attractions to young men were not sordid vices, but elevated spiritual connections. They believed they were the inheritors of a noble tradition, appreciating the fleeting, tragic beauty of youth in a way that the vulgar masses could never understand. The epicenter of this emotional earthquake was Eton College. Like many men of his class, Escher had attended the elite boarding school, and in many ways, he never truly left. For most boys, the intense romantic friendships formed in the dormitories of Eton were a phase, a product of isolation and puberty that faded as they entered the adult world of marriage and business. For Escher, Eton was not a phase. It was the peak. It was the only place where he had felt truly alive. He wrote with agonizing nostalgia about his school days. He described his feelings for other boys as rapturous. He remembered the way the light hit the playing fields, the specific smell of the classrooms, and the overwhelming heart-stopping beauty of the golden lads, those young men who were at the absolute zenith of their physical perfection, untouched by the decay of age or the cynicism of the world. This obsession with the golden lad became the central pillar of his internal life. He was terrified of getting old. He viewed aging as a kind of moral failure, a slow slide into ugliness and irrelevance. To stave off this fear, he needed to be near youth. He needed to bask in its glow, to warm his cold hands on the fire of someone else's vitality. He convinced himself that he was a mentor, a guide who could shepherd these young men into adulthood. But beneath the high-minded talk of mentorship lay a ravenous hunger for emotional intimacy that his marriage could never satisfy. In the 1880s, while he was already a married father and a rising political figure, Escher took a risk that seems almost suicidal in retrospect. He anonymously published a small volume of poetry titled Foam. It was a slender book, easily overlooked, but its contents were a roadmap to his heart. The poems were odes to beautiful young men, filled with classical allusions and a yearning sadness. In an era where the sodomy laws were draconian and social ruin was just one rumor away, publishing Foam was an act of reckless compulsion. It was a signal flare sent up from the fortress of his respectability, a desperate cry to be known, to be seen, even if he couldn't sign his name to it. Whatever danger he felt was mitigated by the unique silence of his class. The British aristocracy operated on a system of tolerant amusement. As long as you didn't frighten the horses, as long as you didn't bring the police to the door or cause a public scene, your private eccentricities were your own. Everyone knew, and no one said a word. Escher was safe because he was one of them. He was protected by the very hypocrisy he helped to enforce. This duality, the public moralist and the private romantic, created a profound tension in his life. He was a man split down the middle. In the corridors of Whitehall, he was cold, calculating, and ruthlessly efficient. He reorganized the War Office with a surgeon's precision. He managed the king's affairs with the detachment of a chess player. But in his journals, he was a weepy, sentimental adolescent, constantly falling in love, constantly having his heart broken by the inevitable passage of time. He would visit Eton frequently long after his own school days were over, ostensibly to check on the school's administration or to visit the sons of friends. But the true draw was the atmosphere. He would walk the grounds watching the new generation of boys, looking for that spark, that perfect embodiment of youth that he could fixate upon. He began to cultivate relationships with these students, inviting them to tea, writing them letters, positioning himself as a benevolent uncle figure. It is easy to look back with modern eyes and see a predator, and indeed the power dynamic was grotesquely imbalanced. Here was one of the most powerful men in the empire, focusing his attention on teenagers. But Asher did not see himself that way. In his own mind, he was a romantic hero, a connoisseur of beauty. He believed his interest was purely benevolent, a way to help these young men reach their potential. He blinded himself to the reality of what he was doing, wrapping his desires in layers of poetic justification until he could no longer see the line between mentorship and exploitation. This lack of self-awareness would prove to be his most dangerous flaw. As long as his fixations were directed at the sons of friends or distant acquaintances, the damage was contained. These young men would eventually leave Eton, go to Oxford or the army, and drift out of his orbit. The romance would end. Esher would mourn the loss of their youth, and then he would find a new golden lad to adore. It was a cycle of infatuation and melancholy that he could manage. But what happens when the object of your obsession is not a stranger? What happens when the golden lad is living under your own roof? As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Esher's eyes turned toward his own nursery. His second son, Maurice, was growing up. Maurice was different from his older brother Oliver. Oliver was sharp, independent, and somewhat cynical. He had his father's brain, but none of his father's romanticism. Maurice, however, was softer. He was handsome, eager to please, and possessed a vulnerability that Esher found irresistible. Esher began to look at Maurice not just as a son, but as the embodiment of everything he worshipped. He saw in Maurice a reflection of his own lost youth, a chance to relive those rapturous Eton days vicariously. The boundaries between father and son, already thin in the peculiar atmosphere of the Brett household. It is not unsettling because of what it reveals about physical acts, but because of the sheer, crushing weight of its emotional demand. Esher did not write to Maurice as a father writes to a son. He wrote as a lover writes to a beloved who is far away. He wrote of yearning. He wrote of the physical pain of separation. He described the ache of missing Maurice's presence in the room. He projected onto this boy, who was barely out of short trousers, the full force of a midlife romantic obsession. Esher was terrified of his own aging, terrified of the loss of relevance and beauty that comes with time. By anchoring himself to Maurice, he felt he could stop the clock. If he could live inside Maurice's experiences, if he could feel what Maurice felt, then he, Reginald Brett, would never truly grow old. But for this psychological alchemy to work, Esher needed raw material. He needed Maurice to be more than just a dutiful son. He needed him to be a co-conspirator. And so, the grooming began. It was subtle, woven into the fabric of their daily lives, disguised as paternal concern and mentorship. Esher encouraged Maurice to be open with him in a way that was radically unconventional for the time. Victorian fathers were typically distant figures, disciplinarians who saw their children at breakfast and perhaps before bed. Esher, by contrast, wanted to be Maurice's best friend. He wanted to be the only friend. "Tell me everything," he would urge in his letters. "Do not hide the smallest thought." He wanted to know about the other boys at Eton. He wanted to know who Maurice found handsome, who he had crushed on, the specific texture of his romantic friendships. He created a confessional dynamic where Maurice was expected to offer up the details of his private life for his father's consumption. Esher would then respond with his own confessions, treating the boy as an equal, sharing his own rapturous memories of Eton, his own attractions, his own secret Greek love. It was a profound violation of boundaries. Escher was taking the normal, began to dissolve. Escher didn't just want to raise Maurice, he wanted to be Maurice. He wanted to crawl inside his son's life and experience the thrill of adolescence all over again. The letters began to flow. At first, they were just the affectionate notes of a father to a son away at school. But slowly, the tone shifted. The language became hotter, more intense. My dearest boy, my beloved Molly. Escher began to demand total emotional transparency. He wanted to know everything. Who are your friends? Who do you love? What are you feeling? He was grooming Maurice to be his emotional partner. He was laying a burden on the boy's shoulders that no child should ever have to carry. He was asking Maurice to be the vessel for his father's frustrated desires, to live out the life that Escher felt he had lost. And Maurice, young and impressionable, wanting nothing more than to please his brilliant, powerful father, opened the door. He began to write back. He began to share the secrets of his heart. And in doing so, he stepped into a trap that would define the rest of his life. The stage was set for a tragedy of intimacy, a slow-motion collision between a father's obsession and a son's identity. The perfect facade of the Brett family was about to be tested from the inside, and the man who ruled the empire was about to lose control of his own home. If you could peel back the heavy velvet curtains of the late Victorian era and look into the private study of Viscount Escher at Orchardley Park, you would not find the plans for army reform or the secret correspondence of King Edward VII on his desk. Not late at night. In the small hours when the house was silent and the rest of the world was asleep, the most powerful man in the British Empire was usually hunched over a piece of cream-colored stationery, his pen scratching frantically, pouring his soul out to a teenage boy. The recipient of these letters was his second son, Maurice. But in the private geography of Escher's mind, the boy was rarely Maurice. He was Molly. It was a nickname that softened him, feminized him, and wrapped him in a layer of intimacy that excluded the rest of the world. To the public, Maurice Brett was a young aristocrat, a cadet at Eton, a future officer in the Coldstream Guards. To his father, he was a mirror, a muse, and a captive audience of one. The correspondence between Escher and his son, which began in earnest when Maurice left for Eton in the late 1890s, is one of the most unsettling archives in British aristocratic history. The way Escher's mood rose and fell with Maurice's attention, it could not have been invisible. But she adhered to the code of her class and her generation. She kept the peace. She maintained the facade. As Maurice moved through his teenage years, the inevitable crisis of adolescence began to loom. He started to look outward. He had friends his own age. He had interests that didn't involve his father. He began to talk about girls. For a normal father, this is a bittersweet but proud moment. For Escher, it was a betrayal. It was the first crack in the mirror. Escher's reaction was not to forbid these new interests. That would have been too crude, too authoritarian. Instead, he employed a strategy of inclusion. If Maurice had a friend, Escher had to befriend him too. If Maurice liked a girl, Escher had to meet her, critique her, analyze her, and ultimately position himself as the confidant regarding the relationship. He inserted himself into every equation. He became the third wheel in his son's social life, ensuring that no connection Maurice formed could ever be entirely independent of him. He effectively colonized his son's future. When it came time for Maurice to choose a career, the army was the natural choice for a boy of his class. Escher, the great military reformer, naturally facilitated this. Maurice joined the Coldstream Guards. He looked dashing in the uniform. He was the picture of the young officer. But beneath the scarlet tunic, he was a young man without a compass. He had never been forced to navigate the world alone. He had never made a decision that hadn't been subtly guided or explicitly ratified by his father. Escher's anxiety during this period was palpable. The army meant mess dinners. It meant deployment. It meant a world of men where fathers were not invited. It meant the potential for Maurice to find a new mentor, a new authority figure, or worse, a lover who would displace Escher from the throne of his affections. To counter this, Escher ramped up the intensity of the correspondence. He visited Maurice at the barracks. He pulled strings to ensure Maurice was stationed where he could be reached. He used the power of the state to keep his son within arm's reach. But time is the one enemy that even a viscount cannot defeat. Maurice was growing up. The golden lad was becoming a man. The soft, pliable features of the boy were hardening into the face of an adult. For a man like Escher, whose love was predicated on the worship of youth, this created a terrifying dissonance. He loved Maurice, yes, but he was in love with the boy Maurice was, not the man he was becoming. This is where the tragedy shifts gears. As Maurice aged, Escher did not stop loving him, but the nature of the obsession began to curdle. He needed a new fix. He needed fresh foam to borrow the title of his poetry book. He needed someone who could provide the spark that Maurice, simply by virtue of growing up, could no longer supply. Enter the Great War. The catastrophe of 1914 shattered the Edwardian illusion. It swept away the garden parties and the Romanov isolation. It turned the golden lads into cannon fodder. For Escher, the war was a double horror. It threatened the destruction of the British institutions he had spent his life building. And more intimately, it threatened to take Maurice away from him permanently. The war also brought a new figure into the spotlight, a man who would complicate the father-son dynamic in a way that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. As the war machine ground into gear, Escher found himself relying more and more on a young, capable, sharp-witted secretary named Lawrence Burgess. Burgess was not Maurice. He was not a golden lad in the classical poetic sense. He was professional. He was middle class. He was ambitious. But he was young. And he was there as Maurice was pulled away by the duties of a soldier, duties that Escher himself had helped define. Escher found himself alone in the drafty corridors of power. The vacuum that Maurice's absence created was unbearable. It had to be filled. And so the pattern began to repeat itself. But this time, the stakes were not just the emotional health of a son, but the safety of a nation. Escher had blurred the lines of parenthood with Maurice. He was about to blur the lines of national security with Burgess. The Molly letters were about to be replaced by secret cabinet minutes, and the private obsession was about to bleed into the public record in a way that would stain Escher's legacy forever. The gilded cage he had built for Maurice was unlocking, but Escher wasn't letting the boy go free. He was simply expanding the prison to include the War Office. Maurice, now an officer, found that even in the trenches, he could not escape the shadow of his father. Escher was everywhere. He was in the dispatches. He was in the strategic planning. He was in the very air the army breathed. Maurice wrote home from the front, trying to sound brave, trying to sound like the man he was supposed to be. But the letters he received in return were not the stiff upper lip encouragement of a Victorian patriarch. They were the frantic, needy, suffocating cries of a man who felt his world slipping away. Escher was losing control. And a man like Reginald Brett does not lose control gracefully. He grips tighter. He pulls strings. He begins to make mistakes. As the guns of August 1914 began to thunder across Europe, signaling the end of the old world, the Brett family was fighting its own quiet, desperate war, a war for autonomy, a war for identity. And the casualties of this private conflict would be invisible, buried under the weight of medals and titles, hidden in the edited pages of journals that would not be read for 50 years. The boy was gone. The soldier had arrived. But the father was still waiting in the study, pen in hand, refusing to turn the page. The summer of 1914 was the last gasp of the old world, a final frantic season of debutante balls and garden parties before the machinery of the 20th century tore the sky open. For most of Britain, the outbreak of war in August was greeted with a strange, naive enthusiasm, a sense that a great cleansing storm had arrived. But for Reginald Brett, Viscount Esher, the sky was not clearing, it was falling. He knew better than almost anyone what was coming. He had spent the last decade redesigning the British Army precisely for this moment. He knew the terrifying efficiency of the German war machine. He knew the logistical nightmares that awaited the British Expeditionary Force. But his terror was not merely geopolitical. It was deeply, selfishly personal. The war was not just an attack on the empire. It was an attack on his golden lads, the generation of young men he worshipped. The aesthetic ideal he had built his emotional life around was about to be fed into a meat grinder. And at the very front of that line stood his son, Maurice. Maurice Brett, the Molly of the letters, the boy who had been groomed to share his father's soul, was now an officer in the Coldstream Guards. He was 26 years old, handsome, popular, and utterly exposed. The uniform that Esher had helped design, the regiment that was the pride of the social calendar, suddenly, these things were no longer costumes for a pageant. They were targets. When Maurice shipped out to France, a silence descended on Orchardly Park that was louder than any artillery barrage. Esher was left alone in the echoing halls of his power. The Romanov circle was broken. The daily feedback loop of affection, the intense mirroring gaze of his son, was gone. For a man like Esher, whose identity was constructed entirely through his influence over others, this isolation was a kind of death. He was a vampire, cut off from his blood supply. He wrote to Maurice constantly, his letters following the young officer into the mud of Flanders. But the war had changed the frequency. Letters were lost, delayed, or censored. The immediate gratification of the emotional bond was severed. Esher sat in London or Windsor, moving toy soldiers on a map, advising King George V, while his own heart was out there in the trenches, cold and wet and terrified. It was in this vacuum, this terrifying silent space left by Maurice's departure, that Lawrence Burgess stepped into the light. Burgess was not a golden lad in the classical sense. He was not an aristocrat. He did not have the languid, effortless grace of the Etonians Escher usually fetishized. He was middle class, the son of a doctor, diligent, efficient, and sharply intelligent. He had come into Escher's orbit professionally as a secretary. In the stratified world of 1914, he was a functionary, a man who took notes, organized files, and disappeared when the real gentleman began to talk. But Escher saw something else. He saw availability. He saw a young man who was physically present when Maurice was not. He saw a blank canvas. The transfer of obsession from Maurice to Burgess was not instantaneous, but it was relentless. It began with work. Escher, overwhelmed by the demands of the war and his own anxiety, began to lean on Burgess for more than just typing. He needed a confidant. He needed someone to listen to his fears, his theories, his gossip about the king and Kitchener. Burgess, ambitious and likely flattered by the attention of such a powerful man, listened. Slowly, the professional barrier eroded. The late-night work sessions turned into intimate conversations. The letters Escher wrote to Burgess when they were apart began to mimic the Molly letters in tone. He started calling him LB, or my dear boy. He began to fret about Burgess's health, his comfort, his happiness. He began to groom him not as a son, but as a surrogate. But there was a problem. Lawrence Burgess was a young man of military age in a country that was rapidly running out of soldiers. The pressure to enlist was immense. White feathers were being handed out to men in civilian clothes. The posters of Lord Kitchener were pointing at every young man in London. Your country needs you. Burgess, to his credit, felt the pull of duty. He wanted to go. He wanted to do his bit. But Escher was paralyzed by the thought. He had already lost Maurice to the trenches. Maurice was alive, but emotionally absent. He could not bear to lose Burgess, too. The thought of being truly alone without a young male companion to reflect his vanity and soothe his anxieties was more terrifying to Escher than a German invasion. And so, the great reformer, the man who had preached efficiency and meritocracy to the British Army for 10 years, decided to break the rules. This is the moment where Escher's story shifts from a psychological tragedy to a political scandal. He did not just discourage Burgess from enlisting. He used the full weight of his shadow influence to ensure that Burgess would never hold a rifle. Escher pulled strings that only he could pull. He first arranged for Burgess to be commissioned as an officer, but not just any officer. He had him appointed as an aide-de-camp, ADC. An ADC is a staff officer, a personal assistant to a senior commander. It is a uniformed role, yes, but it is a role that exists in headquarters, in chateaux far behind the lines, where the champagne is still cold and the mud is only on the boots of the messengers. It was a blatant abuse of privilege. While the sons of coal miners and shopkeepers were being gassed at Ypres, Lawrence Burgess was safely ensconced in a staff car, driving Viscount Escher to meetings. Escher had effectively drafted Burgess into his own private army of one. He had turned a national emergency into a personal convenience. But even being an ADC was too close to the war for Escher's comfort. Staff officers could still be shelled. They could still be captured. Escher needed Burgess closer. He needed him in London. He needed him in the room. In 1916, as the Battle of the Somme was chewing up 60,000 men in a single morning, Escher orchestrated his masterpiece of nepotism. He managed to get Lawrence Burgess appointed to the War Cabinet, Secretariat. The War Cabinet was the inner sanctum of the British government. It was where Prime Minister Lloyd George and his closest advisors made the decisions that determined the fate of nations. It was a room of supreme secrecy. The minutes taken there were classified at the highest level. And there, sitting in the corner taking those minutes, was Lawrence Burgess, a man with no political experience, no high-level security clearance, and no qualification other than being the emotional crutch of Viscount Escher. Escher had engineered it so that Burgess was essentially his eyes and ears in the room when he couldn't be there himself, but more importantly, it kept Burgess in Whitehall. It kept him in London. It kept him alive. The relationship between the two men during these years was intense and suffocating. They lived in what Escher called a cloud, a private world of shared secrets and emotional dependency that floated above the grim reality of the war. Escher wrote to Burgess with a frequency that bordered on the manic. He poured out his heart, his fears, his love. "You are the only person who understands," he would write. "I am only half alive when you are not here." For Burgess, the situation must have been dizzying. He was privy to the greatest secrets of the war. He knew about the Dardanelles disaster before the public did. He knew about the shell shortages. He knew about the political knife fights between the generals and the politicians. And he held this knowledge because an aging aristocrat was in love with him. Meanwhile, in France, Maurice was living a very different reality. He was surviving. He was witnessing the destruction of his generation firsthand. The letters from his father continued to arrive, but they must have read like missives from another planet. Escher would write about the beauty of sacrifice, about the nobility of the struggle, using the high-minded, romantic language of 19th century poetry. Maurice, standing in a trench that smelled of rotting flesh and cordite, would read these words and feel the distance widening. Escher was fighting a war of imagination. Maurice was fighting a war of attrition. The golden lad was tarnishing. Maurice was becoming harder, more cynical. The war was stripping away the softness that Escher so adored. And as Maurice hardened, Escher clung tighter to Burgess. Burgess was still pliable. Burgess was still safe. Burgess was still there to be molded. The psychological triangulation was complete. Escher had split his obsession in two. Maurice was the distant ideal, the hero in the mud, the figure of tragedy and romance. Burgess was the domestic reality, the comfort, the safe harbor. Escher played them off against each other in his own mind, comparing their letters, their affection, their devotion. But the guilt was always there, scratching at the back of Escher's mind. He knew on some level that he was a hypocrite. He was the man who had advised the king to be the father of the nation, to share in the suffering of his people. Yet here he was, hoarding his own treasure, refusing to pay the price that every other father in England was paying. There is a particularly chilling anecdote from this period. Escher was visiting the front, a VIP tour, safe and guided, and he met with some of the young officers. He wrote later about how beautiful they looked, how splendid their youth was against the backdrop of ruin. He seemed unable to see them as men who were about to die. He saw them as aesthetic objects, as characters in a tragedy that he was watching from a box seat. He wept for them, certainly, but it was the weeping of an audience member, not a participant. He returned to London, to the warmth of his library, and to the waiting arms of Lawrence Burgess. He had seen the war. He had felt the frisson of its horror, and then he had gone home to safety. As 1917 dragged into 1918, the strain began to show. The war was not ending. The golden lads were almost all gone. The list of dead Etonians in the Times grew longer every day. Escher's world was emptying out. His contemporaries were dying of old age. His young loves were dying of machine gun fire. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life. He began to realize that even if Maurice survived, he would not come back as the same boy. The Molly of the Eton letters was dead, killed not by a German bullet, but by the loss of innocence. And Burgess? Burgess was growing up too. He was becoming a man of affairs, a man of secrets. He was no longer just a secretary. He was a power broker in his own right, thanks to Escher's patronage. Escher was creating monsters. He was creating men who were shaped by his influence, but who would eventually outgrow his need for them. He was building a legacy of emotional wreckage that would outlast the war itself. But the war did end. The guns fell silent in November 1918. The survivors crawled out of the earth. Maurice came home, alive but changed. Burgess emerged from the war cabinet, his head full of state secrets. And Escher? Escher looked around at the brave new world, a world of democracy, of socialism, of jazz and modernism, and realized with a sinking heart that he did not belong in it. The Edwardian curtain had fallen. The golden age was over. But the secrets of the war years, the letters, the pulled strings, the cloud he had lived in with Burgess, remained. They were locked away in tin boxes, hidden in the archives, ticking bombs of scandal that Escher was determined to bury. He had survived the war, but he had lost the peace before it had even begun. The final act of his life would not be played out on the grand stage of empire, but in the claustrophobic confines of his own obsessions, as the ghosts of the past began to close in. Peace, when it finally arrived in 1918, did not bring relief to Viscount Escher. It brought a terrible ringing silence. The great engine of the war, which had consumed his every waking hour and justified his every frantic maneuver, had been shut down. The War Office returned to its mundane bureaucracy. The frantic telegrams ceased, and the golden lads, those who had survived, came home, took off their uniforms, and began the messy, ordinary business of living. For a man like Escher, whose emotional life was predicated on high drama and the suspended animation of youth, the return to normalcy was a catastrophe. He had thrived in the cloud of the war years, a space where intense emotions were validated by the proximity of death. Now the cloud was dissipating, and he was left standing in the cold light of the 1920s, an era he neither understood nor liked. The post-war world was loud, vulgar, and fast. It was the age of jazz, of short skirts, of labor strikes, and socialist rumblings. The rigid, deferential society that Escher had spent his life manipulating was cracking apart. But the true crisis was not in the streets of London. It was in the drawing rooms of his own heart. Maurice came back. He had survived the trenches, a feat that felt miraculous, given the casualty list that had decimated their social circle. But the Maurice who returned was not the Molly of the letters. He was a man of 36, hardened by the slaughter he had witnessed, weary of the emotional games and deeply entrenched in his own domestic life. Years earlier, in 1911, Maurice had married the famous musical comedy actress Zina Dare. At the time, Escher had been devastated. It wasn't just that Zina was an actress, though. That was a bitter pill for a man who prized aristocratic discretion above all else. It was that Maurice had chosen a woman. He had chosen the conventional path of heterosexual marriage, fatherhood, and public respectability. He had chosen to grow up. The war had suspended the reality of that choice. While Maurice was in danger, he was still Escher's to worry about, to pray for, to write to. But now, with the danger past, the reality of Maurice's independence settled in like a stone. Maurice was a husband. He was a father to his own children. He had a life that did not require Escher's constant supervision or emotional input. Escher tried to maintain the old rhythms. He wrote letters. He demanded visits. He tried to spark the old rapturous intimacy. But the feedback loop was broken. Maurice responded with dutiful affection, not passionate confession. The mirror was dull. Escher would look at his son and see a middle-aged man with thinning hair and practical concerns about money and property. The golden lad had vanished, replaced by a civilian. It is a cruel irony of the Greek love ideal that Escher worshipped. It has no mechanism for aging. It worships the blossom and despises the fruit. Escher loved Maurice, but he could no longer be in love with him, because the object of that love, the vulnerable, beautiful youth, no longer existed. Left with this void, Escher turned his gaze back to Lawrence Burgess. Burgess had emerged from the war as a man of substance. His time in the war cabinet had given him a taste of real power, and he was no longer the wide-eyed secretary who needed Escher's protection. He was a survivor of the Whitehall trenches. Escher clung to Burgess with a desperation that was almost painful to witness. He insisted on their daily rituals, their shared secrets. He tried to recreate the cloud of the war years, dragging Burgess back into the hermetic seal of their relationship. But Burgess, too, was moving on. He was looking for a wife. He was looking for a future that didn't involve being the nursemaid to an aging Viscount's ego. Escher's reaction to the changing world was to retreat. He spent more and more time at Orchardly, his vast, damp country estate in Somerset. The house became a mausoleum of memories. He sat in the library, surrounded by the ghosts of the Victorian age, and began to write. If he could not control the present, he would control the past. He began to edit his journals. He began to curate his correspondence. He published The Tragedy of Lord Kitchener, a book that settled old scores and cemented his own version of history. He wrote Ionicus, a tribute to his old Eton tutor, William Johnson Corey, the man who had first taught him the philosophy of Greek love. It was a retreat into nostalgia, a way of living in a world where everyone was still young, beautiful, and speaking in the coded language of the classics. But even as he curated his legacy, he was terrified of it. He knew what was in those boxes. He knew that the letters from Molly, the diaries detailing his infatuations, the records of his maneuvers to save Burgess, all of it was dynamite. He was a man sitting on a powder keg of his own making, holding the match of history in his hand. He oscillated between the desire to be known and the desire to be respected. He wanted the world to understand the depth of his capacity for love, yet he knew that the world would call it something else entirely. He began to sanitize the record. He instructed his sons on what could be published and what must be suppressed. He was editing his own soul for public consumption. The Romanovs, the nickname the Brett family had given themselves in their heyday, were crumbling. His daughter, Dorothy, known as Brett, had turned her back on the aristocratic life entirely. She cut her hair, befriended the bohemian set, and eventually followed the writer D.H. Lawrence to New Mexico to live in a desert commune. It was a rejection of everything Escher stood for: the order, the tradition, the subtle exercise of power. Yet, in a strange way, she was the only one who had inherited his romantic radicalism. She just directed it toward art instead of boys. Sylvia, the Rani of Sarawak, was living her own melodramatic life in Southeast Asia, a queen in a jungle kingdom that seemed as fictitious as Escher's own internal world. And Eleanor, the silent, enduring wife? She remained at Orchardly, moving through the rooms like a shadow, managing the servants, pouring the tea, witnessing the long, slow fade of her husband's vitality. There is a profound sadness in the figure of Eleanor Brett. She had given Escher everything: her name, her money, her children, her patience, and yet she had never been allowed entry into the sanctuary of his heart. That door was locked, and the key was held by men who were long dead or long gone. By the late 1920s, Escher was physically frail. The sharp, fox-like features had softened into the gauntness of old age. The eyes that had terrified generals were watery and dim. He felt the cold intensely. He complained of the silence in the house. He would sit by the fire, reading the letters he had written 30 years ago. He would read the letters from Maurice at Eton, tracing the ink with a trembling finger, trying to summon the ghost of the boy he had loved so consumingly. My dearest boy, the letter said. My own beloved. It was a form of self-torture. He was mourning a living person. Maurice was alive, visiting on weekends, talking about the stock market or the weather. But to Escher, the real Maurice was dead, trapped in the amber of 1905. The power he had wielded for so long, the ability to make or break careers, to whisper to kings, meant nothing to him now. King Edward was dead. King George was a solid, boring man who needed little advice. The new politicians were men of the people, laborites and socialists who looked at Escher as a dinosaur. He had won the game of power, but he had lost the game of life. He had spent his years building walls to protect his secrets, only to find that walls keep people out, but they also lock you in. He was a prisoner of his own discretion. In 1928, he published Cloud-Capped Towers, a memoir that was lyrical, beautiful, and utterly evasive. It was the final coat of varnish on the facade. Critics praised his style, his insight into the Victorian mind, but they didn't know they were reading the words of a man who was screaming for connection in an empty room. As the decade drew to a close, Escher sensed the end was near. He began to organize his affairs with the same ruthless efficiency he had once applied to the War Office. He wasn't afraid of death. He had been flirting with the idea of the next great adventure for years. But he was afraid of being forgotten, or worse, being remembered correctly. He summoned Maurice. He summoned Oliver. He gave them their instructions. The archives were the final battleground. He needed them to protect him one last time. He needed them to be the guardians of the myth. But even as he prepared to leave the stage, there was one final twist, one final irony that would prove that for all his planning, Reginald Brett could never truly control the human heart. The Molly letters, the evidence of his overwhelming boundary-breaking love, were not burned. They were kept. Perhaps by accident, perhaps by sentiment, or perhaps because Maurice, the victim and the beneficiary of that love, could not bear to destroy the only proof that his father had loved him, however imperfectly. The stage was set for the final act. The curtains were closing on the Edwardian era, and the whisper behind the throne was growing faint. But whispers, if they are dark enough, have a way of echoing long after the speaker has fallen silent. By 1928, the world had moved on, but Viscount Escher had not. He remained at Orchardley Park, a figure carved from the marble of the Victorian age, surrounded by the deepening silence of the Somerset countryside. The house, with its high ceilings and drafty corridors, had become a fortress of memory. To the few visitors who still made the pilgrimage to see the grand old man of the Edwardian court, Escher appeared frail, his skin translucent like parchment, his hands trembling as they held a teacup. Yet the eyes, those sharp, observant eyes that had once terrified generals and charmed kings, remained undimmed. They watched the modern world with a mixture of disdain and resignation. He spent his days in the library, wrapped in shawls, surrounded by the physical evidence of his influence. There were the dispatch boxes from the War Office, the leather-bound volumes of Queen Victoria's letters he had edited, the private notes from King George V. But his attention was rarely on these trophies of state. Instead, he returned again and again to the tin boxes that held his private heart, the letters from Maurice at Eton, the notes from Lawrence Burgess during the war, the faded poetry of his youth. This was the final tragedy of Reginald Brett. He had spent a lifetime accumulating power, pulling the strings of the British Empire from behind the curtain, only to find that power offered no comfort against the cold reality of mortality. He had built a life on the worship of youth, on the belief that beauty and vitality were the only things worth possessing. Now confronted with his own decay, he felt a profound sense of failure. The golden lads were gone, some dead in the mud of Flanders, others, like Maurice, lost to the mundane tragedy of growing up. The relationship with Maurice had settled into a painful, polite rhythm. Maurice, now approaching 40, was a dutiful son. He visited, he wrote, he managed the estate. But the Molly of the letters, the breathless, adoring boy who had once been his father's entire world, was dead. In his place was a man who seemed tired, a man burdened by the weight of his father's expectations and the complexity of his own life. Escher looked at him and saw only what was lost. He saw the thinning hair, the thickening waist, the practical concerns of a husband and father. He loved Maurice, but he could no longer find himself in Maurice. The mirror was broken. And so Escher turned his controlling gaze toward the only thing left that he could shape, his legacy. He knew, with the cold clarity of a historian, that his life would be scrutinized. He knew that the letters he had written, thousands of them, filled with rapturous language and intense emotional demands, were a loaded gun pointed at his reputation. In the moral climate of the 1920s, despite the loosening of some social corsets, the revelation of his Greek love inclinations and his obsession with his own son would have been catastrophic. It would have destroyed not just his name, but the carefully curated image of the monarchy he had served. He summoned his sons, Oliver and Maurice. They were to be his literary executors. It was a final masterful stroke of manipulation. By making Maurice responsible for the archives, he ensured that the person most compromised by the secrets would be the one holding the key to the vault. Maurice would have to protect his father to protect himself. The instructions were precise. They were to edit his journals and letters for publication. They were to present the world with the portrait of the statesman, the advisor, the patriot. They were to use the blue pencil ruthlessly. In the winter of 1929, Escher's health began to fail rapidly. He refused to go to a hospital. He wanted to die as he had lived, in control, surrounded by his own things, in his own house. He lay in the great four-poster bed at Orchardly, drifting in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, he did not ask for the king or the prime minister. He asked for Maurice. He needed to know that the bond, however frayed by time and reality, was still there. On January 22, 1930, Reginald Brett, 2nd Viscount Escher, died. He was 77 years old. The public reaction was predictable. The Times published a glowing obituary, praising his service to the crown, his role in reforming the army, his wisdom as a constitutional advisor. He was hailed as one of the great architects of the modern British state. Flags were flown at half-mast. The king sent a telegram of profound condolence. To the world, a Titan had fallen. But at Orchardly, the real work was just beginning. In the months following the funeral, Oliver and Maurice retreated to the library. They unlocked the tin boxes. They began the task of sorting through 50 years of correspondence. It must have been a surreal, perhaps traumatic experience for Maurice. Here, in his father's handwriting, was the chronicle of his own grooming. Here were the letters that had shaped his entire adolescence, the words that had bound him to a man who loved him too much and too strangely. "My beloved boy," the letters whispered from the page, "my soul is knit with yours." Oliver, cynical and detached, likely viewed the task with a grim pragmatism. He knew his father's nature. He knew the secrets. His job was to sanitize the record for history. But for Maurice, Holding those pages must have felt like holding a live wire. They made their choices. They cut the references to the golden lads. They removed the most intense passages about the teenage boys at Eton. They excised the frantic, jealous letters to Lawrence Burgess that might have revealed the depth of Esher's manipulation of the war cabinet. They crafted a version of their father that was sterile, noble, and safe. This edited version was published in 4 volumes as the Journals and Letters of Reginald, Viscount Esher. It became a standard text for historians of the era, a primary source that was, in reality, a carefully constructed fiction. For decades, this was the Esher the world knew, the eminence grise, the cold tactician, the loyal courtier. But here lies the final inexplicable twist in the story. They did not burn the originals. Perhaps it was sheer volume. There were too many to destroy without a bonfire that would have raised questions. Perhaps it was a historian's instinct. Oliver, like his father, respected the sanctity of the document. Or perhaps, and this is the most haunting possibility, Maurice could not bring himself to destroy the evidence of love. Despite the suffocation, despite the boundary crossing, despite the way his father had colonized his emotional life, those letters were the defining artifact of Maurice's existence. They were proof that he had been adored. They were proof that for a brief, shining moment, he had been the center of the universe for one of the most powerful men on earth. To burn them would have been to erase the Molly that his father had created, and perhaps Maurice was not ready to let that boy die completely. So, the letters went back into the boxes. They were stored away in the archives, ticking like a time bomb, waiting for a generation that would understand them differently. The years passed. Another world war came and went, destroying the last vestiges of the aristocratic world Esher had championed. Oliver died in 1963. Maurice died in 1934, only 4 years after his father, worn out perhaps by the burden of being a golden lad in a world of lead. The boxes gathered dust. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that the lock was picked. James Lees Milne, a biographer, with a sharp eye for the nuances of character and access to the restricted archives, began to read the originals. He saw the gaps. He saw what had been cut. He saw the Molly letters. When Lees Milne published the enigmatic Edwardian in 1986, the facade finally cracked. The world was introduced to the real Viscount Esher, not just the man who reorganized the War Office, but the man who had lived a life of agonizing emotional duality. The revelation did not destroy his reputation so much as complicate it. It turned a marble statue into a human being. Suddenly, the history of the Edwardian court made more sense. Esher's refusal to take public office was not just modesty, it was self-preservation. His obsession with the moral image of the king was a projection of his own need for a perfect front. His frantic energy in reforming the army was driven by a desperate need to protect the young men he worshipped. The story of Reginald Brett is ultimately a story about the cost of repression. It is a story about a society that demanded a rigid, suffocating normality from its leaders, forcing men like Esher to live in the shadows. But it is also a story about the abuse of power. Esher did not just suffer, he made others suffer. He used his influence to warp the lives of his son and his secretary, bending them to fit the shape of his own desires. He was a man who wanted to have it all, the power of the state and the passion of the poet. He wanted the respect of the king and the love of the schoolboy. For a time, through sheer force of will and intellect, he managed to balance these contradictions. But the cost was paid by the people closest to him. As we look back at him now standing in the shadows of history, he is no longer the ghost behind the throne. He is fully illuminated, flaws and all. We see the brilliance, yes. We see the patriotism, but we also see the lonely, terrified man in the library at Orchardly, writing letters to a phantom, trying to hold back the tide of time with ink and paper. He was the master of the British Empire, but he was a slave to his own heart. And in the end, that was the only master he could never overthrow. The visitor to Orchardly Park today will find a landscape that has changed, but the bones of the estate remain. The great library where Escher sat is still there, though the books are different. If you walk through the grounds, past the lake where he once walked with his golden lads, you might feel the heavy, melancholy atmosphere that hangs over the place. History has a way of flattening people into caricatures. We remember the heroes and the villains, the reformers and the reactionaries. Reginald Brett, 2nd Viscount Escher, was all of these and none of them. He was a creature of his time, a Victorian romantic trapped in the machinery of the modern state. His legacy is not just in the structure of the British Army or the archives of the royal family. It is in the dusty boxes of letters that survived the fire. It is in the uncomfortable, complicated truth that love, even a love as flawed and selfish as his, is the most powerful force in history. It drives men to build empires and to destroy families. It makes them heroes to the nation and monsters to their children. Escher thought he was writing the history of his age. In reality, he was writing the history of his own longing, and that perhaps is the only history that truly lasts.